Hello, JBS viewers, and welcome to the ISGAP Hour. That's ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. I'm David Harris, and in addition to being a host on JBS, it's my privilege to serve as a vice chair of ISGAP and to be joined once again by the founding director and the visionary of ISGAP, Dr. Charles Small. Welcome back, Charles.
Great to be here with you. Thanks.
Since we last spoke on this show, lots of things have happened, and especially one that I want to talk about initially. You have spoken on previous shows about the infiltration of foreign money into American universities and how that has been changing the mindset about Jews and America and democracy. Texas A&M, one of the universities that you had named, has recently made I'd say a historic decision. Can you talk to us about the decision and what it means?
Sure. So as you know, ISGAP has been doing a research project called Follow the Money for many years. And we've been mapping how Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood has been funding American universities. So Qatar...
Wait, Qatar, this tiny little speck on the map that can barely be seen, is at the center of the story?
Correct. So Qatar is a tiny country with only 350,000 citizens, and yet it gives more money to American universities than all the countries in the world.
Why?
So we believe that Qatar, the royal family of Qatar, basically entered into a bay'ah, which is a spiritual oath, an Islamic spiritual oath, with the Muslim Brotherhood. So they represent the interests of the Muslim Brotherhood. And as many people know, the Muslim Brotherhood is a reactionary social movement. It takes a perversion of Islam and fuses it with European Nazism, fascism, and anti-Semitism, and calls for Israel's destruction. And then actually its spiritual leaders like Yosef Qaradawi and others have always preached that the true believer, the true Muslim, is obligated to finish the work of Hitler. So this is a deeply anti-Semitic, genocidal form of anti-Semitism.
But what does it have to do with Texas A&M and other American universities?
Correct. So Qatar funds American universities as well as other cultural institutions. It has about $1 trillion in assets, which are
Trillion with a T.
With a T, which our team,
Wow.
a forensic accounting team, has sort of mapped out. And what they do is they're funding universities using soft power to influence American higher education. And also what Qatar has done, they created a small town near the capital called Education City. And they've taken...
I visited there, by the way, a couple of times.
Interesting.
And there are what? There are six American universities.
6 American universities. There's also a French university and a Canadian university. There was a British university, but they closed down in 2020. So they've set up campuses there, and they fund these universities to the tunes of many billions of dollars are going to these universities.
Can we stop for a moment? Can you name the 6 American universities? I think our viewers will want to know.
Right. So there's Texas A&M, which just announced their closure, Carnegie Mellon, Georgetown, Northwestern, and Cornell.
And Virginia Commonwealth University.
Virginia Commonwealth, and there's the University of Calgary, and the Sorbonne is also there.
The Sorbonne?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we know why the British University closed down in 2020?
So UCL, which is a prominent, good university.
Highly ranked.
Yeah, one of the top universities in the United Kingdom. There was threats of a parliamentary inquiry into the functioning of the UCL's campus in Doha and some of the issues pertaining to human rights and influence. And I think the threat of a parliamentary inquiry was enough for the university to close its doors.
Okay, so now let's go to Texas A&M. And why would this tiny speck, even with its affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood, be interested thousands of miles away in a university in Texas?
Right, so what we uncovered is that there was a contract between the Qatari regime, the Qatar Foundation, and Texas A&M.
Uncovered meaning it was not meant to be found?
No, it was not meant to be found. In fact, Texas A&M went out of its way for many years to try to hide the contents of this contract and the research that they were doing in Qatar.
Though it's a public university?
Correct. It's a public
university that tried to hide a contract that it entered into.
Absolutely. And there were lawyers and human rights organizations trying through freedom of information requests to get access to these documents, and Texas A&M was trying to hinder this for many years.
But ISGAP was able to find the documents.
Correct. We found elements of the contract through our work, and we discovered 502 research projects that was part of this contract of over $1 billion in funding. And the IP, all of the intellectual property for this research that was being done at Texas A&M's campus in Qatar was going to be owned by the Qatari regime. So all the intellectual property was going to be owned by Qatar. And we found 502 research projects. Of the 502 research projects, we were very concerned with 58 projects that could have dual use for military and even nuclear research.
What's the connection between Texas A&M and the fields of nuclear research and defense?
Right. So according to the president of Texas A&M, nothing. And they said that our research, the report that we published in November of 2023, was part of a misinformation campaign. But our research is academic, it's high caliber scholarship, everything was sourced and footnoted and referenced. A few days ago, ISGAP just published a follow-up report, volume 2 of our report.
On Texas A&M specifically?
Correct, on Texas A&M specifically, where we go deeper into our research, where we show the nature of the 57 research projects that have military and potential dual-use research for military and nuclear research. Texas A&M denied that there was any nuclear research being done or nuclear engineering. We document the professors who are experts at this, who work at Texas A&M in Qatar. One professor in particular is working on several research projects which could have potential use for nuclear research. So we're calling for Texas A&M and the state of Texas and the federal government for transparency, to do an investigation into our concerns and to settle once and for all the nature of this research.
Okay, and then a big development came when the Board of Regents, which oversees Texas A&M, met.
Correct.
What happened?
So several weeks ago when they met, when the Board of Regents, they oversee the functioning of Texas A&M.
They were, in effect, the Board of Trustees.
Correct. So in a decision that was made, usually when resolutions are discussed in their sessions, there's discussion, debate, and then votes. There was no debate, no public discussion, but the regents voted 7-1 to close the campus in Qatar. And many commentators internationally in Texas, in the United States, and in Qatar point to our research as uncovering something that caused this unexpected decision.
So it's an amazing outcome. On the other hand, some people have asked, the actual closing will not take place for a couple of years. What does that mean for the research you've referred to during that interim period between now and when the university ends its relationship?
Right. So I think given Qatar, given the regime's connection to the Muslim Brotherhood and anti-American, anti-Semitic reactionary social movement, given the fact that Qatar has good relations with the Iranian revolutionary regime, they have good relations with the Taliban and other radical Islamist organizations, and as everybody knows, they house the leadership of Hamas and they fund Hamas. And they supported Hamas in their efforts against the state of Israel for many years. So I think given the situation in Qatar and in the region, I think it's incumbent on the United States of America to ensure that this research and the intellectual property that is owned by Qatar, thanks to this agreement with Texas A&M, is held at the highest levels of transparency, and there should be investigation into this research, and to ensure that the intellectual property is not being transferred to Hamas or to Iran's, the Iranian regime, which is clearly trying to get nuclear weapons as we speak.
So Charles, to be absolutely clear for our viewers, this is but is not only about Jews, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. You're really framing a major national security challenge for the United States of America in this kind of an arrangement, aren't you?
Absolutely, and I think that the type of challenges that this poses is sort of an immediate threat to national security. And I think a longer term threat is the fact that Qatar has been funding anti-Israel, anti-American curriculum development at American universities. They've been funding groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, which is an outgrowth of the
Oh,
Muslim
you're
Brotherhood.
saying that they have been funding, you believe?
Yes, we believe that
There's a connection between Qatari money, however it's packaged, and groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, which operates on American campuses and seeks the end of the state of Israel and supports Hamas genocide. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we're saying it could be direct, it may be indirect, but SJP
But
comes out of the American Muslim Association. These are directly linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is being funded, aided and abetted by the Qatari regime. So the connections are clear, ideological, political connections. So when October the 7th happened, it was a catastrophe that we all sort of saw unfolding in the southern part of Israel. On October the 9th, when we went back to our universities and we witnessed this explosion of anti-Semitism at our finest American universities, where Jewish students and faculty are continuously being made to feel uncomfortable, and SJP claimed that they weren't supporting the struggle of Hamas, but they were part of the struggle of Hamas. They were part
So they were
of a
not on
terror.
the outside looking in, they were on the playing field. And
Correct, and this is in their words. They were supporting a terrorist organization as defined by American law. And professors and students were coming to champion not only the Muslim Brotherhood, but Hamas directly. And the logic that people were saying that the Jews, by being in Israel, by occupying the land, invited this violence upon themselves, and that professors and students are arguing as we speak at Columbia, at NYU, at our finest American universities, is that the occupation has to end by all means, and all means is legitimate, including violence and including sexual crimes that have been committed against Israeli Jewish women. These are words that I witnessed at Columbia University to teach in by some of the brightest professors and doctoral students at Columbia University.
this was at the School of Social Work?
Correct, yeah.
So, Charles, hearing this, are there alarm bells ringing in Washington, in the administration, in the corridors of Congress, both houses, both sides of the aisle? What's the response?
Well, I hope so. And as you know, ISGAP has been speaking to members of Congress and the Senate and other relevant departments in Washington.
Are they listening?
I believe there's interest, and we'll see. We'll see if the laws are being passed to, I think, ban SJP from campus and to stop the anti-Semitism on the campus, but also in the classroom. And we have to remember that 40 years ago, in documents that were seized by the Swiss security police, they uncovered documents from the Muslim Brotherhood that 40 years ago were arguing that they were going to use anti-Semitism in the United States, A, to distance Israel from the United States, and B, to weaken and fragment American society and to weaken the greatest democracy in the world. And fast forward 40 years later, we can see the billions and billions of dollars that are being poured into American universities, into our publishing houses, into our economy, is starting to have the desired outcome of the Muslim Brotherhood. And anti-Semitism is not only a threat to the Jewish community, but it's a threat to American democracy and stability in our society and internationally.
Charles, I said to our viewers before and now, I'm a vice chair of ISGAP, so obviously I'm not totally objective. But I've been in the Jewish world for nearly 50 years. I cannot think of many projects that are more important, that get to the root of the issues we're talking about. When people ask, what's going on campus? How do we explain it? Is it because of a president or a provost or a dean? ISGAP is saying something very different. It goes far deeper. Open your eyes and see the extent of it. So in that sense, I hope viewers will understand and appreciate the very unique and specific role of ISGAP at this moment in time. But let me ask you then, is it just Texas A&M we're talking about?
No, so ISGAP will be publishing more reports in the coming weeks. We have a report that will be coming out about Cornell University. We discovered $1.95 billion that the Qataris have given to Cornell. In addition...
But isn't that for a medical school? And isn't the medical school part of a one world approach where we all kind of help each other? What's wrong with that?
So in addition to 1.95 billion, we also illustrate how the Qataris gave $8 billion worth of infrastructure. They created a state-of-the-art hospital and medical school, the Cornell Medical School. So it's over, it's about $10 billion that we've uncovered, and there's probably more. And yes, the argument is it's being used for medical research.
Doctors, medical care. Hey, come on, what's wrong with that?
Great.
So what's wrong with it?
Well, if we're aiding and abetting a regime that's committed to the weakening of the United States of America, the destruction of Israel, and the murdering of Jews around the world, in addition to being sexist and homophobic and anti-democratic in general, I think it's a problem to give legitimacy to aid and abet a regime like that, and to transfer our intellectual property of cutting-edge research in medicine, environmental studies, in military, in oil, to a regime of that nature with allies that are really operating in the kinetic field, carrying out terror attacks and fighting Western democracies around the world. They're killing American soldiers as we speak. So there is something wrong with that. And I think we need to, A, understand the magnitude of the influence Qatar is having on our society, in our media and our cultural institutions, and to rethink this relationship and to understand how Qatar is using anti-Semitism to distance Israel from the West, to delegitimize the Jewish people, to fragment America. And as Elie Wiesel always taught, anti-Semitism begins with the Jews, but it doesn't end with the Jews. This is not a parochial Jewish or Israeli problem, but this is really an assault on the democratic principles of our country here in the United States.
Some have argued that our hands are tied because Qatar is too important to the United States. We have a military base there. And yet we're also discovering, Charles, and this may be our last topic for today, that Qatar is not just dealing with universities and not just dealing with student groups, but also the political process, which may explain why some in Washington don't want to touch Qatar. We saw what happened in Brussels, Europe's capital, where a number of members of parliament, the European Parliament, were found with lots of Qatari cash. Is ISGAP also taking a look at Qatar's involvement in the political process, in addition to the educational sector and student groups?
Right. So we're focusing on higher education, but as we drill deep into the subject matter, we're finding the influence of Qatar sort of is pervasive. It's in the economic sector. They're buying real estate in New York and other parts of the United States. They're investing in law firms and PR companies. We found that they have, large accounts at 13 prominent public relations companies in the United States. And we know that the Qataris have paid these PR firms to attack and delegitimize Americans, congressmen and senators who are critical of Qatar. So they're interfering in the academic, higher education sphere, but also in the political sphere as well.
Wow. Well, JBS viewers, quite a story from Dr. Charles Small, the founding director of ISGAP, and something, as we discussed, that poses a major threat to the national security and the future direction of the United States. We're going to come back to this topic again and again in the ISGAP hour, but now for the remaining time, we want to segue to another very important and timely discussion. Stay tuned.
So David and I are pleased to welcome three distinguished guests on a special segment of the ISGAP Hour, Fighting Anti-Semitism. Our first guest is Sunni Ali. Sunni Ali is a ISGAP Research Fellow and Associate Professor at Northeastern Illinois University in the Education, Inquiry, and Curriculum Studies Department. He has a doctorate degree in Educational Administration from Roosevelt University in Chicago. I'm also pleased to introduce the audience to a colleague and friend, Professor Ansel Brown. Ansel is also a research fellow at ISGAP. He's an assistant professor at North Carolina Central University at the School of Law, where he's also the co-director of the Social Justice and Racial Equality Institute. And I'm also pleased to introduce you to another friend and colleague of ISGAP, Hannibal Hamdallahi. Hannibal is a professor, associate professor of political science, and he's the director of the African American Studies program at Fisk University. Additionally, and importantly, he's a founding member of the Board of Trustees of the John Lewis Institute for Social Justice at Fisk University. And I think this is an auspicious moment for David and I to welcome our three distinguished guests at the end of the month. First of all, this is Black History Month, which we should also note. And on the 28th of February, ISGAP and Fisk University, thanks to Hannibal and our three colleagues here, are having a special symposium which will be made available to the public on Zoom that will be dealing with the resurgence of anti-Semitism and racism. And Fisk University is a prestigious, historically black university where the famous W.E.B. Du Bois was a scholar there as well, so it's a distinguished university with lots of history. So thank you guys for joining us. It's great to see you. And I'd like to ask you, Hannibal, now that we're doing the symposium at the end of the month, and I know you've been dealing with issues of anti-Semitism in your work, also with ISGAP, how do you see these sort of issues since October the 7th playing out in the United States and in academia?
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for having me here. It's an honor. One of the things that we wanted to do with this symposium was to celebrate the remarkable achievements our communities have been able to accomplish by working together for so many years throughout the centuries here in America. The media doesn't frame. I think that a lot of America, especially the students and the younger folks, they have become victimized to, I would say, erroneous framing of the issues. And one of the advantages of an institution of higher education is to help our community to kind of understand some of the things that are taking place. For instance, a lot of what I've been hearing on campus has been framed between Jewish people versus Palestinian people. It's way beyond Israel. It's way beyond that sort of frame. And I tell some of my students that sort of thinking can sort of become dangerous. Jewish people are 20% of all Jewish Americans are Jews of color. There are Jews in Morocco, Nigeria, Ethiopia, all over the world. So it kind of harkens to if an American, given that we were in Iraq and Afghanistan for over 20 years, everything that was done, in those countries, we can't look at it and say that belongs to all Americans. We have politicians on the left and the right. Maybe Donald Trump is a good example. Every time he says something, I don't think that every American has to sort of own up or take the blame for everything that he says and does. And so the symposium is a good opportunity to have a discussion about some of the things that are taking place. A lot of my students, they've never taken a course on anti-Semitism. A lot of them kind of understand what racism is, but they don't have a good, healthy understanding or definition of it. Sometimes we think that these things are given just because we're at HBCU, but these things are serious issues. They take time to understand. We're looking forward to this opportunity to sort of discuss these things further.
Thanks, Hannibal. So Ansel, if I can turn to you, more than 70% of American Jewish people since October the 7th have experienced anti-Semitism. And as Hannibal was saying, it's not just at Fisk University, but I think throughout the United States, there aren't really courses on issues of contemporary anti-Semitism. How do you see anti-Semitism being covered within curriculum, Ansel? And is there a difference between historically black colleges or the environment or the atmosphere with the more, I guess, mainstream universities that a lot of American Jewish students have been going to for the past, say, 2 generations, where they're experiencing sort of a really hostile environment in this moment?
Yes, well, Charles, there's certainly a need for more curriculum addressing anti-Semitism. When I was a student at Harvard Law School, there was a group on our campus called Justice for Palestine during the Second Intifada. And I walked to Harvard Square and I saw them lobbying some of the same slanders that we're seeing today on college campuses at the State of Israel at that time. And what I recognized then is that contemporary anti-Semitism is the new anti-Semitism. There's nothing more convenient to those who are hateful towards the Jewish community than to target the Jewish collective vis-a-vis the State of Israel. And so we established a group then to address the anti-Semitism on our campus. And I just want to say that I believe much of what we are seeing today is the product and the result of what was hatched decades ago on college campuses across our country. And so there is certainly a need for us to be more intentional, more strategic, more collaborative in addressing the issue of contemporary anti-Semitism. I think there's a pretty strong consensus that classical anti-Semitism is a type of hatred that is collectively denounced. But what I would say is that the collective sort of targeting of Jewish people by way of unfairly condemning and demonizing and scapegoating the State of Israel is the new anti-Semitism. I will say that the accusation of genocide is the new libel of deicide. And so there is certainly a need to address what we're seeing on college campuses. I taught a class this summer in international law, and frankly, I was quite troubled with the sentiment that I saw from some of the students. And what I gathered is that much of this anti-Israel demeanor is something that is being fomented at the undergraduate level on college campuses across our country. And I don't think there's a particular difference between what we're seeing on HBCU campuses from what we are seeing at majority campuses. I might even suggest that it could be worse at majority campuses at some of these elite institutions where some of the great so-called thinkers of our time have become complicit and tacit and perpetrating the new anti-Semitism of our time, contemporary anti-Semitism that's being lobbed at the State of Israel.
Thanks, Ansel. And turning to you, Sunni. Sunni is a professor of education, but also has experience in the music industry and music production, and is a scholar of cultural studies and issues. And Sunni, could you comment on how, we're speaking about anti-Semitism in the university context. How do you see the anti-Semitism that perhaps began decades ago, as Ansel was saying, was hatched at elite universities a generation ago? How do you see this permeating, or does it permeate sort of popular culture in the United States, in music and in sports? What's your take on anti-Semitism in that context?
Yeah, so thank you again for inviting me, and I really appreciate being on this platform. One thing is clear, and I think we've been talking about this a lot in ISGAP, that Jews in America oftentimes are seen as being white and colonizers. So a lot of the scholarship in the African American community that tended to identify Jews as being white, because whiteness is a huge umbrella that's used to include other ethnic groups that once, at one point in history, weren't considered white. Jews weren't white. Over time, that happened and unfolded. And so, unfortunately, in the music, popular culture, there's this kind of anti-Jewish sentiment, particularly at my college in Chicago. It's a pro-Palestinian university I'm at. The university is very pro-Palestinian. When I say the university, I mean there are many professors that stand with the Palestinians. The Palestinians are seen as being oppressed, and the Jews, because they are termed white, are the colonizers, not connecting that the Jews had always been there, that Jesus himself was a Philistinian or Palestinian Jew. So that's not never discussed. And so unfortunately, a lot of the sentiments that resonated through music, through hip hop, and through other sentiments regarding the status of Jews in Israel and how it's a settler colony resonates in many Chicago communities, and particularly at my campus. I have to say this, I think the three of us would be considered like Uncle Toms for our community, because many African Americans stand with Palestinians. Ta-Nehisi Coates, a great scholar, visited Hebron to discuss the issues that he saw related to the oppression here in the United States with African Americans. And a lot of African American scholars, like Cornel West included, believe that there needs to be a stoppage of the war. I know we're in Black History Month. I'm going on. I'm sorry. I apologize. But, Dr. King was anti-war toward the end of his life. He discussed about the challenges of war. And so the images that people are getting, the information, it's one-sided. It's not showing the carnage and the murder of Jews. It's one-sided with showing the Palestinians. So that's where we're at. And it's scary times. I would say, like, I've lost a couple of friends, given my stance, believing that Jews have a right to the land as much as anyone. Historically, Jews have been there before anyone, right? And we're all part of this Abrahamic faith, but it seems like no one is seeing the brotherhood that can come from that. And so that's I think that's where we're at.
Thanks, Sunni. So I wonder if one of you would like to comment on the fact that the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, was always about fighting for social democracy, where all people, regardless of religion, race, economic background, would be equal under one legal system, right? This is what we all fought for. This is what I think, of all the non-African American communities, the Jewish community was very involved in the civil rights movement and certainly the anti-apartheid movement. Today, Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood actually has its roots in Nazism and white supremacy. So how is it possible, as you were saying, Sunni, that people in the African American community, Cornel West and others, are actually supporting Hamas, which is a social movement based on an ideology that comes out of Nazism, literally, and calls for the extermination, not just the dismantling of the State of Israel, but the extermination of the Jewish people. How is it possible that this has become perceived in academia and in many sectors of American society as something positive and even progressive?
I would just say real quick that so I don't think that I'll be considered an Uncle Tom at all. I think that my work definitely speaks for itself, but I do quite understand but you're right, Charles. The Jews and blacks, Jews and African Americans, if you ask students what is the connection between Jews and blacks, they don't know, but that's not their fault. As an educator, I think that's my fault. I look at that as that's my burden that I must sort of bear and make sure that I do more to help students to understand. Fisk University is one of the many Rosenwald universities. Jews and blacks together, they formed the oldest and largest civil rights organization in America, NAACP. Now, tell people that Du Bois, I think he was the only two Protestants or only two Christians. The other founders were Jewish people, and so just sort of explaining how important these connections were, how intimately tied the fight was between these two groups in doing the freedom rides. Yes, blacks were killed and they were bombed and they were hosed and things like that. But there were a lot of Jewish individuals who took some of those freedom rides down south, and in some instances they never made it back. Jewish people were killed during those freedom rides to help bring justice to the South. Even for supporting MLK and marching with Martin Luther King Jr., some temples, some Jewish worship centers were bombed. Popular movies and culture and things like that. They only showed the black churches being burned, but Jewish people had a lot of their property destroyed and desecrated as well. And it's also just, like I said, brushing aside what we see with our own eyes. We know that one of the administrators in the Trump administration left the administration after the Charlottesville, attack, March for the Right, because the president at the time, Donald Trump, didn't want to. He basically assigned blame for both sides, as if one side wasn't an aggressor and one side wasn't a victim. So I think that, so going back real quick to the symposium, I had a conversation with some of the students, and we've been having listening sessions, and this has been really great. I've been having listening sessions with the students, and I've been hearing them out. One of the things that came up was boycotting, they're boycotting a lot, but boycotting, I think, McDonald's or things like that. And I look at those opportunities to try to get a better understanding of where they're coming from. Because I say, why boycott McDonald's from an American perspective? It's an African American. I always try to look for America's interest, but from America's perspective, why should Americans lose their job for something that's taking place in the Middle East? Something that they have nothing to do. As you know, African Americans, they kind of have it pretty bad as it is right now, trying to find jobs, trying to find decent wages and things like that. And so some of these things aren't really thought out, but I think it's our job as educators, especially at HBCUs and in other areas where we have their ear. Because if we leave it to Cornell West, we have to understand Cornell West never tried to break into the ranks of the HBCU. We've asked him, we've asked him to even come speak to us and things like that. But it's good to fight for, be a socialist and fight for all these different things at elite institutions where everything is kind of, but it's a different thing. When you don't want to actually come to the ranks where most of the black college students in America are and engage at that level. Well, you can't really say that you're a spokesman for black people, I don't think.
Thanks. And it's an important point. And also, I know that, as you said, some members of the Jewish community helped to establish historically black universities and colleges. And in turn, a lot of Jewish refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe who came to the United States, many were threatened to go back to Europe because they didn't have work. And historically black colleges and universities actually gave a lot of Jewish refugees jobs that allowed them to stay in the United States and survive the Holocaust. Ansel, just to turn to you, I know you're doing a lot of work on Pan-Africanism and Zionism. How do you see the connections on these issues to the work that you're doing?
Yeah, sure. What I wanted to sort of lead with to the previous question is that there are three historical and I would say contemporaneous fallacies that have been disseminated by those who are proponents of Hamas and Islamists. One is that we have an equation of white versus brown peoples that Sunni referred to. And the reality is that the majority of Israelis today are from North Africa and the Middle East, and they are not actually European. And those who do have European ancestry have been, by and large, genetically connected to the Middle East. The other fallacy is that you have the powerful versus the weak. The reality is that Israel is the one tiny, small Jewish nation in a sea of hostile Arab countries. The other fallacy is that you have colonizers versus indigenous. Well, the reality, and this leads to your second question, Charles, the reality is that the Jewish people have a 3,000-year history of being indigenous to the land of Israel. And this is where I see strong parallels between Zionism and Pan-Africanism, because what we have seen with both Zionism and Pan-Africanism is that when one's connection to his or her indigenous homeland is delegitimized and undermined and cut from their sort of everyday existence, then this leaves that people group vulnerable to the kind of oppressions, the kind of demonization, the kind of scapegoating, the kind of discrimination that both Jews and African Americans have experienced. There's a saying that what begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews. And this could be no more true than in the case of African Americans. In Europe, you saw ghettos. You saw the way that Jews were characterized. You saw economic alienation of Jews. You saw so many patterns. Even when Europeans went into Africa, the first thing that they did in order to colonize Africa is that they renamed historic places like Zimbabwe, Great Zimbabwe, to Rhodesia, named for the sort of notorious Cecil Rhodes. Well, what did we see in Israel historically? When the Romans went in and tried to obliterate Jewish connection to the land of Israel, they renamed it to the traditional rival of the Jewish people, the Philistines. They renamed it to Palestine. And I just want to add that there is a sort of common propaganda that we hear that Jesus was Palestinian. And I'm going to riff off of what my dear friend Sunni shared, but he actually was Israeli. He was a Jewish Israeli. And he was born in Bethlehem because he was Jewish. And today, Jesus would not be able to be in Bethlehem where he was born, because today Jews are denied that historic connection to the land of Israel, of Judea and Samaria. There are so many parallels. What I want to say is that many of the Pan-Africanists, Du Bois, so many that I can name, were actually inspired by Theodore Herzl and modern Zionism, because what we saw is that African Americans saw hope and inspiration in the Jewish aspirations to be reconnected to their indigenous homeland, to what we experienced. We saw the alienation and the discrimination that Jews experienced in Europe is very parallel to what we experienced. And the reality is that the champions of civil rights, Dr. King and many others, they drew deep inspiration from the Jewish story. Many of the African-American spirituals, Go Down Moses, Let My People Go, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Martin Luther King's last sermon, where he preached about seeing the promised land, that was inspired by the story of Moshe, who saw the promised land of the Jewish people when he stood on Mount Nebo. So there are so many things I could go on in the parallels by the rivers of Babylon between Pan-Africanism and Zionism. And so what we have seen today in some of the unfortunate sentiment that is taking a side against Israel in this current scenario is contrary to the historic reality that many Pan-Africanists and civil rights leaders saw in our connection between Israel and the African diasporic experience.
Thank you, Ansel. And I think to turn to Sunni, who I know does a lot of work on education and curriculum development, sort of following up on what Ansel was saying, I find it extraordinarily, especially in the United States, where the greatest racist crime, perhaps in the history of humanity, was during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, where Jews were portrayed as not being white and poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. And yet fast forward to today, the Jews are being labeled as white, and it's not welcome to the club and we're very sorry for what happened to you, but now the Jewish community in the United States has become the epitome of racial supremacy, of fascism, of Nazism, of apartheid, of every horrific thing you can think of, is being attached to the Jew. How do you see this being played out at a local level in Chicago in the university educational system? Are these issues being reflected in your environment?
Oh, definitely. Here in Chicago, most recently, the Chicago City Council tried to pass a budget to defund Israel. It went to the Governor Pritzker here in Illinois, and he said, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. I mean, it's so one-sided. And so that really speaks to what's happening in schools. So I could do some consultation in several schools, work at a contract high school here in Chicago, and the history teachers were given this, I want to say, pro-Palestinian curriculum, and so there was a lot of pushback from parents who were Jewish. I kind of was outspoken a little bit about, wait a minute, this is so incorrect, particularly the map that they always show. They show the map where Israel began in 1948, and then they show where Israel is today. And that was the same map used at several high schools that history teachers are doing. So I think it's really important for progressive Muslims, progressive Jews, progressive Christians who've always really stood on the side of history as the family members of Abraham to continue to talk, continue to work together to dispel some of these myths. And our actions is in our brotherhood. I really feel that because we have these beautiful religions, it's how we bring people to our faith. What's the best way to bring people through our faith? It's through our actions. It's how we treat each other. It's the love that we are supposed to minister to each other. And in Black History Month, that's the quintessential essence of our history of overcoming, bringing love to each other and to others, and to try to uplift one another in struggle. And so, unfortunately, that's not what's happening. And I think the heart of the issue is this: because whiteness in America is so beneficial to those who claim it. We have Latinos who aren't even white, and they try to claim whiteness because it means you're winning. I think progressive Jews have to denounce whiteness. I think they have to get out front with other progressive groups and say, we're not white. What are you talking about? That we are part of this multicultural family, that we have the same issues that you have. We've been oppressed, as my brothers have said clearly here. Jews were a huge part of the civil rights movement, a huge part of immigration movement to have Africans go back to Africa. Liberia is the founding country that was discovered and helped by President James Monroe. So there's this great history, as Brother Ansel said, about, Pan-Africanism. And Jews have always been our brothers in the struggle. So how are they now white? And those same white supremacist groups that hate Jews hate Black people too. So Dr. Smith, you always said that the Jews' struggle is the canary in the coal mine, right? So if they're going after Jews, who's next?
Charles, this has been a really timely and important conversation, very revealing conversation. I wish we had more time, but I can't let our guests leave without asking one forward-looking question, if I may, gentlemen. We spoke about the heyday of Black-Jewish relationships during the civil rights struggle. We spoke about historical roots and commonalities. Talk to us about a roadmap towards the future. How do we help ensure that the best days of the relationship between the Jewish and African American communities are not behind us, but ahead of us? Maybe a few thoughts from each of you. Ansel?
Yes, well, there are many things that we can do to engage this. I believe it begins in our local communities. I believe that the synagogue and the Black church needs to come together and have educational, information, community-based project initiatives where we tackle our common sort of issues of concern in our communities together, and that we learn from one another. I mentioned a little bit about the connections between our two histories. Well, I want to go back to that I think can really be illuminated through this sort of communication and exchange between one another, is that the denial of the motherland, is sort of the root of the denial of one's own existence. And that's something that we both share, that we have both experienced, the denial of our connection to our mother, to our motherland, to Africa, and to Israel. And I believe that this sort of connection, this collaboration, I believe that we can have academic programs where African-American students at HBCUs have an experience in the land of Israel to see what's really happening there on the ground, so that we can dispel some of these fallacies that are being sort of disseminated and infecting our community. I believe there are so many initiatives that we can engage. The other thing I want to mention is that we have to steer away from trying to find sort of who's on the bottom of the barrel, right? Sort of the fight to stay off of the bottom. The reality is that what the Jewish community has experienced historically and is still experiencing, and what the African American community has experienced historically and is still experiencing, those two sufferings are not mutually exclusive. It's not a question of whose suffering is worse or whose suffering is different, but we have to find our commonality and recognize that those who are perpetuating anti-Semitism and racism have the same psychosis of demonization, of fear, of envy, of projection that is spewed at both Jewish communities and African American communities alike. I believe if we do this, then the future can be bright and the future can be profound. And I believe that our communities have something very special and something very rich to offer to this world if the world would just let us be and let us live and let us partner together to give the valuable contribution that our communities can add to this world and what is promoted in the Jewish community of Tikkun Olam.
Thanks. Hannibal, Sunni, anything you'd like to add? Very powerful statement. Thank you, Ansel.
Yes, and thank you. I definitely agree with Professor Brown. I would say that one of the things that we can do to move forward is we must reject the politics of divide and conquer. This is something that white supremacist organizations have operated against minority organizations and minority groups in America for a very long time. They don't want to see African Americans and Jewish people together, striving, doing things. So we must reject that. Also, we must reject the media frame that tries to shove down the frame of reference that the media tries to throw down our throats. We must never forget that Hamas is a terrorist organization. That's something that we can never forget. Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization. ISIS is a terrorist organization. And these groups, they not only kill Jewish people, they kill Black people. And so this is something that, as Charles knows, I've sort of studied. They have different groups that are killing Black people all over the world. And that's something that we must always, must never forget. And so in the face of these trying times, Jews, Muslims, Christians, all faith groups, we have to stand up and ground our foot on solid foundations of freedom, peace, justice, equality. There are times where you must be quiet. I get that, but this is a time where leaders must stand up and be courageous, especially African American leaders. We have to stand up. We have to be courageous. I've never ever seen a situation where people are afraid to denounce the systematic killing, rape, point blank. And I'm one of those persons. I didn't want to watch some of the videos that I saw, but people told me about them. But that's something that we should never be at that point in our civilization where we can't denounce that sort of thing. Horrendous. And so Black leaders must stand up. I think this is an easy call to stand up and reject this sort of thing that takes place Remember that we're talking about a terrorist organization, and terrorist organizations, they do terrorist things, and not just to Jewish people, they do it to Black people all around the world.
Unfortunately, on our screen, we have the faces of three very courageous leaders. Sunni, perhaps the last word?
Yeah, I think education, coalition building, political collaborations, they just remain critical to reposition this miseducation that we're seeing. And it's very important also to just discuss that the global rise of neo-Nazism and these extremist groups, they're not going anywhere. They're getting worse. And so it does take progressive groups to stand up against this. I really believe strongly in the intellectual quorums of ISGAP, why it remains necessary to help educate, to dispel a lot of this negative messaging, racial hatred, dispute. I think we have a compelling history, Blacks and Jews. We have a compelling history of how we extinguished the flames of bigotry and created new policies to try to make everybody's life better. We have to celebrate that. We have to be genuine in how we celebrate it. We have to be genuine about how we fight back against anti-Semitism, xenophobia, racism. Our struggles are critical to do that. And when we do that, we'll get the change we need.
If I can just add one thing to what my colleagues said, particularly with what we've seen with October 7th, no other group in the world should be able to understand more what happened on October 7th. Think of men, women, and children, the elderly, kidnapped from their homeland, taken to another hostile place, held captive, oppressed, suffering just insufferable brutalities. We've seen this picture before in the African American community. This is our experience. And so we have to take a stand as vocal as anyone else, more vocal than anyone else, against what we're seeing today in the Gaza Strip.
Thank you, Ansel, and thank you, as I say, scholars and gentlemen. It was an honor to have you on our program with us today. And again, for the viewers, on the 28th of February, ISGAP will be co-sponsoring a conference hosted by Fisk University on issues of anti-Semitism and racism, and for the African American and Jewish American communities to work together and to echo what our three colleagues were so articulate about, is coming together, Christian, Jews, Muslims, our two communities, to celebrate what we've done, as Sunni was saying, to extinguish the bigotry in the world. And we have a lot to offer, and I think the symposium will be very important for people to tune in. So gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us and for all your amazing work and inspiring work.
Thank you.
Thank you.